Right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for the latest webinar from the Freedom Association. Delighted to join you as chairman of the Freedom Association. And the hot topic tonight is, what is the BBC for? Should it be defunded or reformed? And I'm really delighted to welcome a household name in Nick Ross, broadcaster, journalist and campaigner. He launched Breakfast TV, Watchdog, Crimewatch, and flagship radio programs such as BBC's World at 1 PM and The World Tonight. We also have Lord Daniel Moylan, an old friend from the Bow Group, going back to '87, I think we first met, which I chaired the Bow Group, 93, 94. He did a lot in London for Boris Johnson. He was chairman of the London Legacy Development Corporation, deputy chairman of Transport for London, and chief airport advisor to Boris Johnson as mayor on things like Boris Island, which I still think is a good idea, and was made a Conservative peer. I was delighted to hear that last year. He's a Radio 3 fan, but has described the channel as being infected by sort of relentless wokeness. And then we have Andrew Allison, our own TFA, Freedom Association, Walt, head of campaigns. He's done a lot on the BBC and acts a TV tax campaign for the Freedom Association, and has done a lot for like the Taxpayers Alliance and other campaign groups. So delighted to welcome Andrew as well. I'm just going to start the session off because I should explain we tried to get a BBC representative. We went to the top to Tim Davey and corresponded with him, but unfortunately we don't have someone on, so I'm going to fulfill the role for tonight of giving a more pro-BBC argument based on various speeches and things that the BBC have put out. I would start the case by saying that, it's important to say, please, if you have any Q&As, any questions and answers, it's done by typing in on the Q&A box. That's the important one. And we are going to do mainly questions. I'm going to set the scene, questions and remarks, really. But the real choices, just to set those out, is obviously defunding the BBC, and taking away the ability to of criminal sanctions for not paying your TV license, which is compulsory, obviously. Make it a more subscription-only service. That's a choice like Sky News or Netflix, for example. And clearly there are questions that come from that about what you do with elements such as the local radio stations, the website, and also whether you might actually farm off some of the more commercial programs, another way of doing it. Strictly Come Dancing or EastEnders could actually, obviously very commercial and could be on different channels for sake of argument. There'll still be a need for some sort of public funding, I understand, because you can't just switch off TV or radio frequencies. So that's quite an issue. And on the other hand is reform, which I'll be putting a case for. Is reform feasible? What shape could it take? Could it be a paring down of activities, what is essential to support? A bit like the royal family, actually, having to, still support the royal family, but have less royals, no names there, but and decriminalising licence fees. So there's a lot of issues here, and also the charter renewal is 2027. What kind of vision would you paint for that? There's a lot of issues within what we're discussing today. I should say, just personally speaking, I used to say about the BBC that if you doubt its quality and its value, then spend a year in America watching American TV network channels, as I did as a student. I was a student at Wharton University, Wharton Business School, for a year. And I did find the network TV absolutely awful. It was incessant advertising, a lack of depth, no meat on the bones. And even when you got a big story, you'd often sort of, get a lot of adverts about the big story. And when you got to the big story, it sort of passed by without really noticing it often. So it's very much a sort of fast food feeling, I feel. It's obviously not the same as subscription channels, but I'm talking of the network particularly. It's worth saying the BBC is obviously the largest news organization in the world. I think it's less fast food, more meaty. It's more of a sort of Sunday roast type, with lots of analysis and a lot of time devoted to it without the adverts breaking in, obviously. And on drama, I did actually call for the public broadcasting service and making funding calls. It was done through literally calling people up and getting donations in. And the funny thing was that its quality programs were all, or mostly, BBC, under the term of masterpiece theatre, as they put it. But of course, these were just done through donations. I would never wish that outcome or that kind of model to be forced on British people. I'm not saying it is, but I wouldn't wish it to end up there. I think that would be a disaster. And that there would be a real problem of the loss of quality and value and British content. Everything's changed, of course. I mean, Netflix, people point to that as being top quality production standards now, as big budget, big movies. House of Cards is another one. Quality, very high quality, matching the BBC. So has the world changed enough? It's interesting to say that, Line of Duty, which everyone has to mention, I'm sure, is the old model worked in the sense that the broadcast was done the old way on TV channel. There was no streaming before it, and it got 12.8 million viewers on the night, which is quite something nowadays with all the competition. Moving on, another argument is that, if you got rid of the BBC, would it drag down the competitors with it? I'm a great one for Radio 4. I think it's very educational, informative, entertaining. It's a very important programs. It's too wokey in parts now, which is going wrong, but I'd be bereft without it. But, Sky News has a £40 million deficit now, apparently. Would it seek to cut that if it got the opportunity? Would all the channels thereby actually get worse because of cutting BBC? That's the argument. It also provides good value, the BBC, as Lord Hall said that it's used, this is last year, it's used by about 14 million people every day, which is impressive, and 9/10 of adults watch it in a week, and 8 out of 10 children. And then you've got the argument about, being part of our culture, the British establishment, having a unique role. I think the coverage of the Prince Philip's funeral was beautifully done, very respectful. I mean, one can argue about whether too much time was spent on given to it overall, but I think the actual service was beautifully done. It was world-class event coverage. Obviously sports can be done by other channels, football, rugby, cricket, all are done by other channels now and again, and the rights keep coming back and forward and done well. And you shouldn't forget also the foreign affairs role and Bush House and the BBC World at pushing and selling Britain around the world. That's valuable. So in conclusion, I do believe the BBC must be reformed. I think that's, all of us probably believe in that. I think it's particularly incredible. It doesn't monitor routinely its own output, which seems extraordinary. And it must return to impartiality. We had the Emily Maitlis diatribe on Newsnight, which got her into trouble. And just recently, Laura Kuenssberg. allegedly her piece attacking Boris Johnson seems very lacking impartiality. So there's a problem there. There's a problem with the editorial content. I have to point at John Humphreys. He's interviewed me. He's been relentlessly impartial. It's only after he retired that we find out really where he was, his politics were, which I think is quite impressive. So I think reform editorial control, better management, the end of appeasing to woke audiences, the expense of loyal, giving up loyal consumers for these woke audiences isn't good news. Farming off more commercial programs, entertainment programs could be done possibly and focus on quality. So I think reform could work. And maybe where the BBC belongs is indeed masterpiece theatre. Thank you. Now I'm going to hand over to Nick to maybe pick up some of those pro-BBC arguments and take them apart or challenge them or agree with them possibly, but in parts. But Nick, do you want to come back on that?
Okay, thank you, David. I mean, firstly, I think you've given us a very useful corrective. US TV, commercial television, is the best advertisement there is for British television, not just the BBC. I think we should recognise the BBC is part of an ecology, and that whatever we do with the BBC is going to affect the other public service channels, in which I include Sky. This is a true ecology involving very much ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and Sky, and indeed others. We have a British way of doing things, and we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I would also say that I think we've got to be intensely practical. And there's no point saying, well, there are things that the BBC can do which the commercial channels can do, so let's strip out the popular programmes. What, and leave the BBC with the unpopular programmes? I mean, that's no answer to anything. And that's frankly ridiculous. The problem here is there isn't a halfway house. One either has a commercial BBC or one has a publicly funded BBC. I've gone completely full circle. I was one of the first people back in the early 1990s to call for the BBC licence fee to end. I didn't want a catastrophic end. I wanted it to be managed, and I wanted the BBC to manage it itself. We had the coming of the digital age. It was perfectly clear that a system that had been set up when we had analogue television and analogue radio, which used vast amounts of airwaves, it was set up, remember, because people were concerned about military and other commercial needs for the airways. That's why we had a monopoly in the first place. This becomes a complete non sequitur when you have almost infinite airwaves. And it was quite clear that you were going to have, or at least if not infinite airways, infinite bandwidth. And it was quite clear that you were going to have hundreds and hundreds of channels. I must say, it didn't occur to me that you'd have almost an infinity, which is what we do. And if I now turn my phone on and point it at what we're doing now, I can now broadcast this live in broadcast quality from my personal phone. That is the nature of the revolution. And so it occurred to me that the idea of clinging to a license fee constrained the BBC in the old ways of doing things. And it had several really bad repercussions. One of which is, as it became more and more subject to more and more competition, it would be driven to be more and more commercial, even though it was supposedly public service broadcasting. You've given some impressive figures about how many bums on seats they get, how many people watch TV and listen to BBC radio. But that has become their driving preoccupation. It is desperate, just as it is for ITV to get advertisers, it's desperate for the BBC to prove that it's getting that reach and it's getting those numbers in order to justify to politicians and to the public that it should be able to reach into our pockets and purses and take that money, as it were, by right. So I've been very, very much in favour of the BBC being the great British institution that is one of the best known of our institutions around the world, seizing the future for itself, making Britain the forerunner, and it would do this by migrating to subscription television. Now, look, I got absolutely nowhere, as you can tell, because the BBC is still where it is. I remember sitting in a House of Commons committee room being questioned about this, and Michael Gray, the great Lord Gray, telling me I was naive. Well, maybe I was in terms of timing, but I don't think I was in terms of where we were heading. And Now, the fact that you found it so difficult to get somebody to come on and defend the license fee, the status quo, including from the BBC itself, I think speaks volumes, David. It really does. The days of the license fee are now clearly numbered. But could I just say, before handing over, I don't know if it's Daniel or Andrew coming next, in a way, I've come full circle from this. The BBC has missed its opportunity. It's become the Kodak of cameras. It's become the one that watched other people seize the high ground. And unfortunately, perhaps predictably, it's been largely the Americans. And you mentioned Netflix, which is one of the great examples. Still not making substantial profit, incidentally, so we've got to be careful about this. But anyway, the BBC, it seems to me, sold itself in the wrong direction. And I want to be fair to the BBC, it wasn't just its fault. The regulators tried to stop the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 and Channel 5 getting together as a BritBox, as a British thing, in order to try and be British competitive on the open world market. But anyway, where we are now, as I say, coming full circle, because I'm not sure how the BBC can survive without a license fee. I would rather it was through general taxation. There is a lot of hysteria about saying you can't do it through general taxation because of partiality and impartiality. It's absolute nonsense. About a couple of dozen countries around the world have given up the license fee: Canada, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, and so forth. And nobody's telling me that countries like Sweden, like Norway, like Denmark, have given in to the government and are doing the government's bidding any more than the BBC. Might I point out that the new BBC chairman is somebody who's given the Conservative Party £400,000 before we start worrying about whether governments are going to have any influence on corporations. So let's get rid of the license fee, which is costly to bring in. Let's accept we've screwed this up. You cannot make it part commercial because quite reasonably, the commercial channels will go nuts. The newspapers who are already struggling themselves will see this as grossly unfair competition. You have to do one or the other. So, I know, rather to my bitter disappointment after championing a commercial BBC for so long to save its soul, I think now to save its soul, we might have to go to stick with public funding.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Nick. They're very, very interesting. I was coming to Daniel next, actually. Over to you, Daniel. What are your views on this? You're mute, by the way.
Yes, I was told to mute myself, and then of course I'd forgotten that I'd done. Quite right. Well, here I am. And I don't have anything like Nick's length of time reflecting about and understanding broadcasting in this country. I come at this largely as a consumer of broadcasting and not a very happy one, particularly. But I think it's worth, since we're required to have a little balance here and to say some positive things about the BBC. We all have, if not memories, then at least we have some sense of the time when the BBC spoke for the country as a whole and had a high standing and was highly respected. But that's all going back to, and I want to make this point, that all goes back to a time when the BBC was unremittingly middle class. And it was set up as a middle class venture. All the notion of, Lord Reith and his didacticism and so forth, and bringing culture, it was very much the middle classes bringing culture and information and dispassionate analysis to an audience that couldn't be trusted, if you like, to have a say themselves in what is going on. And I think a lot of that, strangely enough, remains. What's changed is not the BBC. What's changed is the middle class. Even in the 1960s and 70s, when they started to adopt their view of what was proper to the working class, when they started sort of EastEnders and things like that, having people on, which never happened when I was a child, with regional newsreaders with regional accents and things like that, and all these things. It was still very much an act of condescension. It was a stepping down from their lofty middle class pinnacle. And the middle class they appeal to today is a narrow, Remain supporting, liberal leaning, London-based leftist the sort of people who will turn out in their droves on Thursday to vote for Sadiq Khan, despite difficulties in putting lengthy lists of achievements together against his name. And the audience that they should be attending to, perhaps on Thursday, is the audience in Hartlepool. We don't know how Hartlepool is going to vote, but certainly the very fact that it's in play and is thought of as a marginal suggests that there is a different nation out there for which they no longer speak. And that is the nation on whom the burden of the license fee falls most heavily, because it is, of course, a regressive tax being the same for everybody. So having made that point about the good side of the BBC, but the fact that it is still unremittingly sort of aimed at a middle class venture, the next question is that was justified to some extent by an educational role, a cultural didacticism, which in my case, I am an assiduous listener to Radio 3. I don't like too much chatter in the background while I'm working. It distracts me, but I'm devoted to the musical channel, and the decline that one has seen there, and which I did refer to in that rather whimsical speech in the House of Lords. The decline that one has seen there is really very, very dramatic, provoked really to some extent by their determination some years ago to catch up with classic FM, if you see what I mean. So what one gets now is, instead of getting proper pieces of music, you get gobbets. You get playlists where they don't actually tell you what the music is that's being played, that it's moved from one piece to another. Sometimes I have to rush to my internet to work out what it is they're actually broadcasting, because they don't always tell you. And so you don't know even what you're playing. All sense of chronology has gone. So there's never on the BBC would anybody tell you that Bach came before Beethoven and they both came before Bruckner. No, there's no sense of chronology, and therefore no sense of development. And all of that is combined with this sort of unremitting commitment to diversity. So that instead of a focus on excellence, which you might have had in the old days, you now get a lot of music played by people simply because they belong in certain categories that feel that, you know, the BBC feels needs more exposure. And I think that decline, and it's manifest in other areas, not just Radio 3, that decline, I think, takes away a lot of the justification for the middle class condescension which the BBC still has. The third thing is, of course, and Nick has explained this very well, and there's no need for me to dwell on it, but the third thing is that the model is bust. The notion of a monopoly speaking for the nation, funded by a national levy, separate from taxation, so that it could be a little bit independent and not a creature of government, that's bust in all respects. And the fact that one has a limitless amount of choice means that the monopoly is gone. They don't, as I say, speak for the nation at large anymore, and it's almost impossible to justify a fixed rate, a flat rate levy on viewers, which to pay for it. So it really is impossible to defend that, and it doesn't surprise me that you can't find anyone to come on and defend the license fee. It's a curious thing that they stick to the criminalization of it. I felt during that debate that in fact the BBC would do better if the license fee became a debt, but a decriminalized one, simply because that's exactly how things worked in with my local authority background. That's exactly how things worked when parking fines were decriminalized. Local authorities collect far more parking fines now that they're processed through the civil courts than they ever did when they were trying to chase them to get a criminal conviction. But the BBC, and this is my final point, seems so determined to defend the existing model that they wouldn't even contemplate that they wanted to defend even the least defensible part of the license fee, which is the criminalization. They wanted to defend that. And it suggests to me that they themselves know that they are on a sinking ship. And I wonder how many of them are actually just saying, we'll milk it for what we can, while the boat is still afloat, and it's after us the deluge. And I think there's quite a lot of that, because it leaves it to us to think what it is we want to do with it. So my final point, if I've still got time, is I do think there are parts of it which should be commissioned by the government, and they include certain educational parts, which I think should be commissioned by the Department for Education, not by our culture department, which I think is far too close to the cultural industries. And there are other parts which are already commissioned, partly at least, such as the foreign language services, which receive a grant from the Foreign Office. And I think that should continue. And there might be other areas where you could say that you wanted to commission certain services, but the rest of it should simply be moved off into the commercial sector. As Nick says, there'd be a period of time in which you'd want to manage this so it wouldn't be catastrophic for people's jobs and for organization and so on. But something along those lines, I think, is where we're going. But the license fee is simply indefensible, and it's got to go.
Thanks very much, Daniel. And now to Andrew Allison, please fire away, and then we'll go to questions after you, Andrew.
It's very interesting listening to what Nick and Daniel have said, and I don't disagree with very much of it at all. And Nick has a long record, a long track record of saying we're going to be in a position where the license fee is indefensible. It's actually going to be bad for public service broadcasting. It's actually going to be bad for the BBC. But as Daniel quite rightly said, the BBC will not move off this method of funding. I've described it as an analog funding system in a digital world. And the BBC, I think, really does need to get real, because I feel it's on a bit of a death spiral at the moment. And I don't particularly want to see the BBC die. That's not what I want. I've campaigned against the license fee for a lot of years now, because I've seen the writing on the wall. Now, if you go back to 2000, and maybe Nick can correct me on this one, 2007, 2008 was when the BBC iPlayer came out. It was around about that time. And people were not watching anything on demand up until that point. And then suddenly the figures were growing exponentially every year for iPlayer, but not just for iPlayer, but also for ITV, for Channel 4, for Channel 5, and more people were watching things on demand. This was at a time also when YouTube was a recently launched service. Twitter came online around about that time. Facebook hadn't been around for very long before this time. And now you can watch live television effectively on YouTube. You can watch television on Facebook. You can watch television on Twitter. The number of smart TVs now has grown a lot in the UK. I think just about everyone who wants to replace their standard television set, if you can call it that, they will replace it with a smart TV. I have a 4-year-old son. My 4-year-old son cannot differentiate between what is live TV and what is not live TV. I don't think that's going to change, because everything is there at his fingertips if his mum and I allow him to have the remote control. Usually grabs it most of the time. So this is where we are, and things have changed. Now, I think there is a role for genuine public service broadcasting in this country. And I do think that should be funded through general taxation. That was the recommendation of a report from the Select Committee back in 2015, when John Whittingdale, who's now Minister of State, of course, was Culture Secretary as well. But that's when John was chairman of that committee and recommended that. He also made some other recommendations that I didn't agree with, but I'll park them to one side. But if you look at Netflix, and I find Netflix great value for money. I have a basic subscription. I pay £5.99 a month. And the amount of Netflix programming that we watch means that it's great value for money. Now, there is some stuff that one might regard as trashy, and certainly plenty of things that I don't watch on there. But if you're interested in, for example, the history of the Second World War, you will find dozens and dozens of high-quality documentaries. Some of them BBC produced as well from years ago, but you will find dozens of high-quality documentaries on demand. I seldom watch live television these days because I like having things on demand. I like choosing a program that I want to watch and watching it at a time of my choosing. And that is the way that the television is going. And I will just leave it on one point, just looking at the sort of the future of broadcasting. The way the technology is moving, and moving at a very fast pace, in 2027, when the Raw Charter is due for renewal, what will live television schedules actually look like? We don't know. It could be that basically live television is just news, it's sport, major events such as Prince Philip's funeral, to give an example. It could be that EastEnders, for example, is simply released on iPlayer and people then watch it at the time of their choosing. It may be that, it may not be that, but we certainly can't discount that. And the BBC is competing in an increasingly competitive marketplace where anyone can just about broadcast and anyone can get quite large audience figures. So the license fee in itself is just something of the past. It's from a bygone age. As I've said before, it's an analog funding system in a digital world. By all means, fund genuine public service broadcasting. And as Daniel said, the rest can just be put into a commercial setting. And I'm sure that the BBC, if it wants to continue to make really good drama, really good comedy, although I don't think the comedy is particularly good these days, if it wants to go down that route, it can actually make a lot of money out of it.
Thanks, Andrew. We've had a couple of questions before, which I'll just turn to now, and then we'll go on to the ones that are on the screen. From Stephen Pontin, if the TV license was to be abolished or substantially reduced, how would the existing BBC services that audiences currently value and enjoy, Radio 3, for example, continue to be supported and funded? I mean, actually, it does raise the issue of radio, particularly, and other things like, the online, the iPlayer, the website, etc. How would one fund that? Not just TV programs. I'll take the second one with that, just so we've got a few to go on. There are many good things about the BBC. This is from Derek Swain. But it is their news and current affairs that is outrageously biased against the Conservative Party and the present PM in particular. Why not support public broadcasting of public funds and decouple the programs that are politically charged to subscription only, so that those that want to drink up the, quote, leftist drivel can pay to do so, whilst the rest of us can happily, carry on to that part of the BBC which meets the original definition of its charter, to inform, educate, and entertain, and feel good about subscribing to the good BBC. So there's a debate about how one divides the output. Any takers on that? Nick, do you have any views on those two questions while we're on? Sorry, you're muted.
That must be the first time in the last year I've got myself out on that, forgive me. I see that Peter Balfour's also asked about this, whether we should separate radio and television. It's a very interesting question. As I say, I think that the whole thing needs now to go under general taxation. I don't think it can work as a commercial operation. The BBC, I think it's gone way beyond that point. I think I agree with everybody on the panel. I think the license is daft, and therefore let's get rid of it. Oddly enough, and paradoxically, the one bit that probably could do extremely well commercially, and I will ask Daniel this, if you don't mind unmuting yourself. Daniel, you say you love Radio 4. How much would you be prepared to pay a week to get Radio 4 news?
Well, it's Radio 3 that I love.
Oh, sorry, Radio 3. Fine.
No, I would pay something a week to have Radio 3, but I would like it to get back to being Radio 3, because I can get classic FM for free on the advertising, and it's become more and more like that. I think a more interesting question is, how much would you pay for the proms? Because without Radio 3, you'd have to think very hard about the proms and the support of the orchestras. The BBC
One of the things, Daniel, I've always felt is that it's grossly unfair to the other broadcasters that the BBC gets the equivalent of all the money for that sort of thing, and that it should be like the Arts Council. If we want to support the arts and indeed good science coverage and so forth, then people should be able to pitch for it. I don't see why Channel 5, Channel 4, ITV and Sky shouldn't be able to pitch for it as well. But that's another issue. Coming to bias, look, we all hate cognitive dissonance, or psychologists call cognitive dissonance. And the more we have an ideology that we feel strongly about, the more our politics is strong, the more we think other people are biased. And that is the case whether we're on the right, whether we're on the left, and it's also the case if we're in the center. There are many people who regard themselves as liberal who refuse to accept this themselves, that they're just as biased as we all are. It's very difficult for any broadcaster not to be criticized by people for being biased. It started right in the beginning, 1926 general strike, of course. Those of you who won't be memories long enough, but who know enough about the BBC, when that was called the BFC by the Labour Party and by many others. I think that stood for the British Falsehood Company. Throughout my career, I've been attacked by the left and the right. I was singled out by was it Peter Mandelson, or I can't remember who it was, when I was covering a Labour Party conference, when I'd embarrassed somebody in an interview, he said, well, we all know he's a Tory. And I had much the same covering a Conservative Party conference. People see bias where there isn't genuinely bias there, or they don't recognize how people with opposite views see some of the other biases that we don't see from our perspective. Having said that, because I do think there's a huge exaggeration about how much bias there is in the BBC, I think it is true that in this country, the sort of people that generally go into the arts, that generally go into news and current affairs, tend to be liberal, tend to be slightly, I'm just going to get rid of that, forgive me, get rid of my phone. And there is also a bias that they haven't taken part in the real world often. A good example of bias is not the sort of thing I think people are complaining about now. If you want to see left-wing bias, look, for example, at the website, BBC's website there. There's a profile of Simon Stevens, who's done a brilliant job over the last 7 years of running NHS England. And nowhere in that profile does it point out that he worked for many years in the commercial sector, commercial healthcare sector in the United States. That doesn't fit somebody's preconceived idea of what a good boss of the NHS should be. So yes, there's bias. I'm not going to pretend there isn't, but I am going to urge people who do have strong views themselves to recognize that people who have the opposite strong views think there's bias the other direction.
Is it the case if you upset everyone equally, then you've achieved the balance you need? Is that right?
We can laugh about this, but this has been the constant dilemma for the BBC throughout, and for the other broadcasters as well. And it's really peculiar that some, because ITV is commercial, for example, and takes advertisements, and it's called the commercial channel, it can get away with far more left-wing things than the BBC can, because it seems to be public services and identified that way. The other thing is, because the BBC is a national institution, I think many people think it should stand up for the traditional British values in a way that many younger people think is sort of very, very much out of tune. It's a genuinely difficult balancing.
Yeah, I can believe that. Do any of the others want to comment on these questions? You want to go on to the next set? Daniel?
Simply on the question of paying, I think we need some imagination about some of this. Just to come to radio, I think one of the things we ought to be encouraging is community control of radio. And rather than have local radio beamed out by the middle-class BBC at the local people, it should be possible to sustain sustain local radio channels with much more local input and control. And I think we should be experimenting with things like that rather than trying to think how to save local radio as it currently exists. On the national radio channels, some of them are perfectly capable of surviving commercially. Others might need, if they were valued, might need some support, or at least for a period when it might be decided whether it was worth continuing them or they could find a way of sustaining themselves on their own. As I say, I think most of the output could actually be moved into the commercial sector, where a huge amount of waste and inefficiency could be removed, and that would be itself a very good thing. And certain items that the government wanted to commission, as I say, at national level, could be commissioned on a direct taxpayer-funded basis. But I think the idea of making the whole thing as it currently stands, a charge on the taxpayer, is only remotely possible if you get radical change first.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I'm just going to, before Andrew pick up on this, perhaps one of the questions, Edward Ward, relevant to this. So if the commercial part of the BBC is moved aside, can the revenue be used to fund the other output? Andrew, do you want to take that?
Yes, before I answer that question, just on a point that Nick mentioned, which I think is sort of rather important. If you watch BBC Question Time, and also on your phone or your computer, you look at the feed that has the hashtag BBCQT. Now, I'm not recommending this at all because I find it the most dispiriting experience, to be perfectly honest. But you will find that the presenters, the audience are biased against the left and are biased against the right, and nothing is aren't any centrist views going on there or anything like that. It's exactly the same program. It's all about perception, and many people do perceive that it's been biased in one way or another. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't some bias. I think there is, and it has been, some of it has been called out. But I just think that's an important point to make, that sometimes people watching exactly the same television program will come up with some completely different opinions about it. Answer to Eddie's question is, well, yes, I suppose it could. I mean, if the BBC is hugely successful, I mean, it has been with Doctor Who, but Doctor Who has gone horribly woke in recent years. But I mean, that was another program that was selling around the world very well. I mean, Top Gear used to be a program that sold very well around the world. Then there's nothing wrong with the BBC using revenues from commercial successes to help fund things that will not be as commercially successful. Because the last thing we want, as you said in your opening remarks, David, and I too have experienced American television, is that it is, if I may say it, it's awful. It really is dreadful. Yeah. And we certainly don't want that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could I make a comment about bias?
Yes, go on, Daniel.
If we think about bias as between the leading political parties, then I think I agree very, very much indeed with what Nick has said, and also Andrew, in that the BBC does try to maintain some sort of balance between the two, is observed and monitored in doing that, and usually fails, but fails because failure is almost inevitable in the system. I think that's what Andrew and Nick are roughly saying, and I think I can agree with that. I think what's really tested the BBC has been in rather the cultural change over the last 5 to 10 years, and the fact that their inability to come to terms with Brexit and the notion of a popular vote actually determining the future of the country was very much on one side of that cultural divide, where largely they sit. And I think a great deal of the antipathy you see towards Boris and the aggression towards Boris is because, of course, he was in many ways the leader and the most prominent spokesman for that campaign, which a lot of people are never ever going to forgive him for. So I think they've failed there, but the fact that they've continued to fail on it and that they've carried on for 4 or 5 years, and this is why I mentioned Hartlepool, even if, assuming the Conservatives win Hartlepool, even if they see that right in their faces, but they are still going to carry on the wrong side of a cultural divide. But there's no attempt at balance there. I'm not suggesting they all switch over to being Brexiteers and Union Jack wavers, not suggesting that. But the balance on that issue and that whole story has completely vanished. And that's where the real driving divide in British politics is today, not between the two main parties.
I agree, Daniel, but take Boris out of that equation, because that is something completely different. The reason that Boris is self and bad-mouthed is because he's self and bad-mouthed by fellow Conservatives. There are many, and I was talking to one yesterday who's a strong Brexiteer, and she was saying, she knows Boris well, she's saying he's chaotic. Look at the inside of his car, the picture of the inside of his car. It's been inside his flat. It's absolute chaos. She says, she's worked for him, that's how he runs things. I think you could take the person, that's not necessarily bias. That is just reporting what people are saying. But I agree with your larger point that I think there's no question that the majority of people, I suspect in Sky as much as the BBC, in Channel 4 and Channel 5, not the BBC, most of them were Remainers. Most of them voted Remain. And I suspect your analysis is right.
But what is striking there, Nick, is I'm not surprised they voted Remain. What is striking is that they haven't woken up to the change that has happened and accommodated themselves to it. That is, and recognise that there is a divide here over which we, at least at the BBC, have to show some sort of real balance. And it's that, and I'm happy to take Boris out of it, although I think there is, I think the point I'm making also is you see that this divide I'm discussing cuts through the existing political parties. So there will be people, you know, with BBC type views inside the Conservative Party. There's no doubt about that. But I'm happy to take Boris out of it. It's the failure to recognise change and respond to it, which is the hallmark of an organisation in tremendous difficulties.
Yes, I mean, my own view is, you know, I don't mind what people's politics are that's interviewing you. You know, there's a professionalism about being impartial, and actually sometimes it goes the other way when someone with a certain viewpoint, it goes so much the other way or is much tougher, that they're actually quite helpful to the opposing view. But as I say, John Humphreys is a good model because everyone was trying to figure out, and he's somewhere, I always thought he was an old liberal, and he sort of said he voted New Labour on one occasion or something. But, you know, good for him that you know, all those years, he's equally tough on everyone. And I think that's a good model to follow. And what worries me, there seems to be a shift or a lack of discipline at the moment in the BBC. You know, as I said, I don't think, I mean, Daniel said about monitoring, Lord Pearson, he was leader of UKIP briefly, but Lord Pearson did at his own cost some monitoring of the BBC, particularly the Today programme, at his own cost. And it did actually lead to a shift away from some bias that was identified by it. But I don't think monitoring is routinely done.
We shouldn't forget other biases, Dan. There are a huge bias against the sciences. Virtually none of the BBC's journalists, and more to the point, their commissioning editors, including those who commission science programs, is a scientist. Don't know the first thing about it, most of them. You'll find that news reporters, even if they're on scientific subjects, say ridiculous things like statistics show that. I mean, none of them would say words show that. I mean, it just shows there is a fundamental mathematical and scientific and statistical illiteracy there, which I think for a great publicly funded organization, maybe if you're listening to something that's commercially put up with it, but there are lots of biases out there, and not just the political ones.
It's a very good point, Nick. And actually, comedy is something that Tim Davie is quite rightly pointed out, because we think, oh, well, that's just entertainment. But, you know, if it's a political program, and there's many of them, often very good, you know, but they often have a very marked political bias, and he's picked up on that, I think, rightly. And, you know, he's made some changes which are quite major. Thank you. I wanted to look at some other questions here. One for Roger Taylor, for example. How do countries like Australia fund public broadcasting, inverted commas, alongside commercial roadcasts? Can we not repeal the license fee and replace with a real-time subscription where you choose what and how long you listen for? I'm just taking a few we've covered a lot of the biased ones, to be honest. Yeah, what about, yes, there's a question here from yours here, Tuwalde, just about BBC's good value for money amongst the young. You know, our panel is older here. Democracy is choice. Democracy, choice is freedom, and freedom is what we live for. What are we doing about the young? And there's a point here about, from Sean Lever, central taxation. Yeah, should we move to central taxation of public service? I wonder if Nick actually could comment on how successful, I was interested in these models, you mentioned Canada, Sweden, New Zealand. Are there any lessons from those? Have they worked well or not? That's relevant to Sean's question.
I think, to Sean's question, the most important thing is what they haven't done is what the BBC is warning us would happen. And that is that the broadcasters have become tools of the government, become political tools of those in power. It just hasn't happened. And I see no reason why that should happen to the BBC for broadcasting in this country either. We have a pretty good tradition. I'm afraid both major parties, it's just too tempting often, do try and get their fingers too often in various quangos and supposedly autonomous institutions. But there'd be a public outcry if it was done to the BBC. I think taxation is the way forward. If you didn't, and if you did have a partner subscription or move to a partner subscription service, you would have to buttress that by an Arts Council of the Air or Arts and Science Council of the Air, where you gave them money to do the things that just, you know, the great thing about commerce, and nobody has been tuned into this if they don't believe fundamentally that free enterprise makes the world go round. But free enterprise only works up to a limit. It doesn't do everything. And you need to make up for the bits that the commercial television or radio wouldn't do. And so you'd have to have some sort of state funding if you want to maintain those qualities.
Yeah. Daniel, do you want to comment on those?
Well, I don't know about, I think the fear that we'd end up like America is always held out in front of us. But as several people have said, I think we'd probably still retain our British way of doing things. And we're slightly, we come from a different background, and backgrounds are formative. So we come from a different broadcasting background. And we start in a different place. So I'm not really that worried about that. I am struck about the fact that in other countries, you get very high audiences for combative news, Australia in particular, combative news programs in which people are very open about expressing a particular view. A little bit like talk radio or LBC, if you see what I mean. But we don't have that on television, but we have a little bit of it on the radio. Other countries have it on television. And I think there are audiences for all of that. I agree with Nick about the science and statistical bias. To raise the terrible subject of climate change, that is the one scientific thing that everybody at the BBC seems to know about. And they have a very clear scientific view, which is completely relentless the whole time. But otherwise, I agree. I mean, Tomorrow's World was the last I ever saw of real science on television. That was a very long time ago when it was actually doing anything intelligent about science.
Yeah. There's another one here from Richard Shuttleworth. Do you think that BBC journalists such as Laura Koonsberg and Emily Maitlis have become too important and now personalities, inverted commas, themselves? Do they impose too many of their own opinions, and should they just report honestly? And then another one was about, should the BBC have sort of televised arguments, discussions where opposing views are expressed? I'm not sure if it's opposing views to the BBC, like here perhaps, or not. But what do we think of that? And Andrew, do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I mean, if you look back sort of history of BBC political editors, I mean, John Cole, for example, I'm sure many people remember his fine Northern Irish accent reporting the news. He was very much a personality at the time in political circles. Everybody knew who he was, and people listened to what he said. So I don't see any difference between, say, Laura Kuenssberg, for example, and John Cole being personalities on the television. But I think that the way that they report things is different. And I do think that that sort of tradition of the BBC from the 1970s, 1980s was strictly much more unbiased. It was very much they reported what was going on. They recorded conversations that they have. Of course, that's the joy of being a political journalist, isn't it? You keep having chats with politicians who feed you information. But I felt that it was done differently. But having said that, many people on the right, going back to the argument that Nick has used, many people on the right will say that Laura Kuenssberg is completely biased against the Conservative Party, and yet she's never had to have a bodyguard to protect her at a Conservative Party conference, which she had to have, disgracefully, at a Labour Party conference. So it is quite clear that I might find certain biases in what she says and disagree with her, but others see different biases. I don't want to go on to that biased argument, but I think the question is framed around bias, really, more than anything else. But I mean, I remember January the 31st last year, the date that we actually left the European Union, when I came back from Brussels that day. And I was watching the television. I was watching it was Sky News coverage. And it looked like Beth Rigby was in mourning. She may as well have a black armband on, to be perfectly honest. And the whole coverage was well, it was laughable, to be perfectly honest, because there was a huge sort of party going on behind them with speakers and people celebrating that we'd left the European Union. But that may as well not have been going on at all, because they were not reporting it. So is Beth Rigby a personality? Well, I don't think she's not that much of a personality, although she is famous for breaking COVID rules, isn't she?
There is there's a question here: why do news readers interview fellow employees, not actual involved persons? Which is an interesting point, actually, because I've noticed there seems to be an awful lot of BBC analysts being interviewed by presenters now.
David, I can answer that.
A reality check really does annoy me, to be honest, because I would argue with reality check on not everything, but on many things. But yeah, Nick, please go ahead.
It's because it's a cliche, and I'm afraid the BBC News is so cliche-ridden, so long ago gave up leading, pioneering the way it presents the news. It is so third-rate now. It's followed the American style. You have to have the newsreader standing up a lot. I mean, it's so many of them are cliches. And this, not only do they interview their own correspondents, their own colleagues, but if the newsreader is called John, then every sentence in reply has to start with, "Oh, John." I cringe with you at this. And it's not, as one gets older, one should be wanting things to be as they were, I suppose. On the contrary, I want the BBC to be much more pioneering, much more in its news to be just cleverer, smarter than this stuff. They've been doing this for so long, and often it's a bit of a fraud on the viewer, because actually the main package has been recorded often, and then it's been edited just in case they need to update it. They have the journalists there as well. It's sort of terribly old-fashioned.
That's interesting.
You also think, though, Nick, that too many of these sort of correspondents in certain fields, be it home affairs or foreign affairs, defence, they seem to sort of move around. Now, Frank Gardner, for example, a highly respected journalist, every time he speaks, I listen, because I know that when he talks about security issues, that he knows exactly what he's talking about. But you've got someone who's the economics editor, and then becomes the political editor, and then becomes the business editor, or something like that. It's a bit like cabinet ministers. They stay in post for a little while. They sort of start to understand how the department works, and then they get shifted onto somewhere else.
Well, I agree with you. I really do, and I think this is why Laura Kuenssberg, for example, is worth every penny. And incidentally, virtually every other news organisation in Britain and many around the world would try and filter from the BBC if they could. I don't mind people becoming personalities well known when they've earned it, rather than just, who was it who said that you become famous just by putting your face into this magic rectangle? And you do. And a lot of people who are newsreaders, for example, have never been particularly out in the field, been great journalists, never broken many stories themselves. I think it's very easy, because your head is in that magic rectangle, to feel quite self-important. Whereas what you're talking about, the Frank Gardners, and I would say Laura Kunsberg and others like that, really deserve the fact that they're well known, and they've stuck with it, and they've become genuine experts.
We're running out of time now. I just thought we'd run for a few minutes longer. But I wonder if there's any last minute points people want to make before we stop. There was one point here, Sean Lever saying about John Cole, Brian Redhead and Brian Walden didn't chase social media followers and retweets like they do now. That's an interesting, playing to social media as well. So I think with that point, and any other final points you want to make, I don't know if you want to finish up, Nick, and then we'll take Daniel's and Andrew's.
Well, I think we've all reached agreement, perhaps unsurprisingly, given where we are, that and why I've been invited here, that we think that the license fee is doomed, and rightly so. The only thing I would disagree with, I've just seen something come up from Sean Lever saying the BBC doesn't call it foreign affairs anymore, they call it world affairs. Well, I think pretty much everybody does. I think the Times does, the Telegraph does, the Mail does. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, actually. In fact, on the contrary, I think that far too often we're a little country now, navel gazing at ourselves, worrying so much, so insular. I don't want to go back to pretend we're a great global power, but I do want to see us as a great globally integrated, where the world is important to us, where we see ourselves as in a global leadership role. And it's not just the foreigners and us, we've got too much about us, but us very much involved with the world and helping to lead the world. And I suppose my greatest regret is I think back in the 1990s, the BBC had the opportunity of continuing to be the world's greatest disseminator of news, of entertainment, of culture. And it's, Andrew called it a death spiral. I hope it isn't, but it certainly looks like it.
Daniel, do you want to?
No, I mean, as I say, I don't think anybody here would set out to destroy a well-functioning BBC. Nobody wants to do that. But it does seem, and I say this death spiral thing does seem to me to be where they are. It's almost as if they are so entrenched that and so unwilling to embrace what people think of them and recognize change, that I really wonder if they aren't just going to give up eventually themselves. If the charter is up for renewal in 2027, that means discussions will start in 2025. So this is going to be a key election issue, in my view, or it could be. And I think the political parties really will have to think what it is they want to say about this, because the BBC is not, as we all agree, not sustainable as it currently is. And with every year that passes, the question becomes harder to avoid. So I think the parties are really going to have to think what their policy for the BBC is going to be.
Thank you. And Andrew?
The charter was renewed for 11 years last time to take it out of the election cycle because fixed term parliament's out. We saw how well that went. We've had election after election. But I've got a feeling that the next general election will be 2024, won't it? Probably spring. So therefore I slightly disagree with Daniel. I don't think it will be an election issue because I think it's going to be a little bit too far out. But I mean, Sean mentioned about social media and these Laura Kunsberg and other people chasing social media hits. Well, I don't blame them. I mean, that's exactly what I would do. I mean, it's a completely different world that we live in. We've got to realize the reason why part of the reason we're having this discussion is because social media has taken over. And I mean that by not just by Facebook and Twitter, but also by YouTube. which gives us the ability at the Freedom Association to put this onto our YouTube channel and for people all around the world to be able to watch what we're discussing tonight, if it interests them. Everything has changed. Everything has completely changed in about the last 15 years. Nick was warning the BBC this many years ago that this was the route that we're going down. And unless the BBC, for example, doesn't try to chase some of the younger people, saying, well, we haven't got lots of younger people watching the BBC now, so we're going to put programs on that we think that they want. And I've got a 22-year-old stepson who never watches live television, never mind the BBC, he wouldn't have a clue. So it needs to look at what its core audience was, I think, and a lot of those people, as Daniel has quite rightly mentioned, decent sort of working class people in the North and the Midlands, they don't feel maybe that the BBC is serving them as well. Now, some of that could be a misconception, some of it could be true, but I think the BBC does need to look at that. Otherwise, this death spiral that it does genuinely appear to be in, it's not going to be able to be reversed at all, which I don't think is in the interests of the country, nor of the world in many ways, because that's one thing we have not discussed is the BBC World Service. And that is a highly respected channel, listened to people all around the world. In fact, you could talk to some people who speak absolutely wonderful English from the Far East. How did you learn how to speak English? Oh, listening to the BBC World Service. It has a far reach. It's an important radio channel. So, I just hope that the BBC can reform. I think it's got to reform without the license fee, as we have discussed. But it does need to reform, because I think the world would actually be poorer without the BBC.
I could reveal its political bias. It would be, if I was in government, I would put more money into the BBC because of the soft power BBC World Service. You've got absolutely right. Mm-hmm. I would also put more money into intelligence and other things as well, but that's another matter. But yes,
I agree, Nick. It's worse. I mean, I always remember it was Gorbachev. When there was a coup against him, it was the BBC he turned to see if it was real or not. And when he heard it on the BBC, he thought, right, this is a real coup. And I thought that is really, it says it all about the world reach, how its values, how it's rated, it doesn't rush. It doesn't try and rush into news. It does.
Well, you get it on Twitter nowadays, though, David.
Yeah, well, Twitter's faster than all of them, actually. That's when you hear what's happening before it gets on the fast news channels. But anyway, thank you so much for all your contributions, which are really gratefully received. It seems to me that we can agree maybe on getting rid of the license fee and the decriminalization possibly, but there's an awful lot of questions about what happens next and how the best way forward. And it does need a whole kind of working commission or working group to do a lot of thinking in these areas and actually put forward some more firm ideas. But thank you, Nick, Daniel, Andrew, for your contributions and for all the excellent questions. This will be put up on YouTube, edited accordingly for ums and ahs or whatever, but that will go up shortly. So thank you for your participation, and we'll be announcing other webinars in due course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.